Today we're talking about basically the last three chapters of Genesis. So we're finishing Joseph's story, and it's going to include Jacob's passing away and the events around that. First, I don't think we need any housekeeping. Do we have any new guests?
Just the rules we changed since last time you taught, which are that we'd like everybody to have a chance to talk. So we're asking people to make one point and maybe keep it under 2 minutes, which is the reason for the timer. And what else was there, Dean? There's a couple other things we were changing up. I can't hear you.
My biggest one is listen to whatever Ruth says when she says it.
Oh yeah, that was the other thing, to try to have a moderator to help spread around the joy.
Good. Spread the joy. I love it. All right. This was the Egyptian house cleaning. As you can see, we're setting the stage. Very beautiful backdrop, lush around the Nile, beautiful houses. And let's just review the Parsha. So I like to put things in context. So in the previous Parsha, Joseph was revealed to his brothers. You guys did the talk. Actually, we didn't do last week's, I guess. Did we? No, there's
No,
none.
we
Okay.
didn't have it last week.
Okay, so basically we missed a discussion on that particular Parsha. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so then it's good. Okay, Joseph was revealed to his brothers. It was the big reveal, and Judah really steps forward and offers himself to replace Benjamin, which really convinced Joseph that really his brothers were repentant, things had changed. And so there was just that wonderful emotional coming back together of the family. And Yaakov comes all the way to Egypt, which seems like an incredible story in that how I was thinking about this family from Canaan who haven't inherited the land yet. So they're wandering in a way. And then now they're sitting in the household of Pharaoh, and Jacob is blessing Pharaoh. If you think of the honor that came upon that family, it's really an incredible story of how God made these miraculous events happen. So now this reading comes on the heels of that, and it starts with Jacob taking Joseph aside and really asking him sincerely to swear by oath not to leave him in Egypt, or not to leave his body in Egypt after his death, and to bring him back to the field of Machpelah. And immediately after that, Joseph comes back to Jacob and brings his two sons, and Jacob starts explaining to him that essentially he wants Joseph's sons to be adopted as his own and to inherit as his children will inherit. And then he flips the birth order, as those of you who've read the Parsha will remember. And it confuses Joseph. Jacob insists, no, I know what I'm doing. Ephraim, who is the younger, is actually going to supersede the older. The next part of the Parsha, Israel declares to all of his sons what will happen in the last days. And it's interesting, when he starts speaking to all of his sons, he uses that term. He uses like the final days. And that kind of gives you a hint that it sounds a little bit prophetic. It sounds like he's talking about the future. And Yair and I had a discussion earlier that this actually has been a debate, that there have been debates about whether or not what Jacob was doing was a statement about the future, about prophecy, or if he was just talking about the present. And so I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about that today, maybe find some interesting ideas. Then Jacob passes away, and Israel's sons then travel to Canaan, and they bring Jacob back. They bury him in the field of Machpelah, so Joseph kept his promise to his father. And then the brothers come back to Joseph because they think that Joseph still has a grudge against them. And he weeps again, he's moved, and he assures them that God used the evil they intended.
Seven times he weeps, and it's always with his brothers.
Yeah, it really stands out. Every time Joseph, you sit there and go, wow, this is not typical. So it's special. But also an important part of that in this Parsha is when he declares, he flips what could have been bitterness and anger towards his brothers and said, what you meant for evil, God turned for good. And he saved many lives. And that's a remarkable quote from this Parsha. So we're finishing the book of Genesis. So the next Parsha, next week, will be Exodus. And we're starting the whole Exodus story in the next Parsha. So now my first thought, I'm just throwing this out as like for meditation, for thinking. And some of you might know the answer to this. It might be obvious to you. But to me, it wasn't immediately obvious. Where I was thinking about Jacob And when he takes Yosef aside, and it almost sounds like a desperate plea, he tells his son, show me kindness, and swear to me that you won't leave me here in Egypt, and that you'll bring me back to lie with my fathers in Hebron, in the cave of Machpelah. And so the question there is why is this so important? Why is it so emotional? Why is he like making Yosef swear to him that his body will be brought back to the land? And I put the little quote here from chapter 47, where you see, this is Yaakov talking to Joseph. Do me this favor, place your hand under my thigh as a pledge of your steadfast loyalty. Please do not bury me in Egypt. Why is Jacob so insistent on not being left in Egypt? And maybe I'll add a small thought that I have that might be a bit of a reveal, but that I think that Jacob is not thinking in the present. I think that Jacob is thinking about the future. He's not thinking about Egypt. He's not thinking about the comforts of Egypt. He's living in the future promise. He's living in thinking in terms of what is coming. And that's why he doesn't want to be left behind. He needs to be where he belongs. He wants to be with his fathers and also with his family in the days to come, even though metaphorically he won't be physically there, he'll be dead. Just my thought. And I think that as we go through, I hope this will make more sense the way I'm thinking about it. So the next thought I just wanted to give out here is that Jacob, when he takes Ephraim and Manasseh, he gives Joseph a double portion. And so we see here this pattern in Torah that birth order is consistently not respected. And I don't say that in a negative way, I say it in a positive way, that obviously when God's in the mix, he's setting things up for the future. There's this thing where, listen, birth order is not as important as humans might make it out to be, and people love the rules. And here I just wanted to highlight that Joseph is receiving a double portion through his two oldest sons, and Jacob adopts those sons, and Jacob is thinking about inheritance in the future. He's very elderly. He knows he's towards the end of his days, and we know that in this context of this discussion, he's already sick. And yet he's already getting ready for the inheritance of Ephraim and Manasseh among the other brothers. Now, you have to wrap your head around this. He's not talking about the inheritance in Egypt. He's not talking about Goshen. He's not talking about goods in Egypt. He's talking about Canaan. This inheritance is only going to happen in hundreds of years in the future. And Jacob is thinking in the present about hundreds of years in the future about the inheritance of the tribes that will descend from his sons. And so I just want to highlight that he's not thinking the way that normal people think, in the sense that the timeline here is way beyond normal considerations. Even a king who's thinking about his kingdom thinks about very immediate threats, very immediate problems. And Jacob is thinking about the promises that God has made, and he's planning and he's travailing over setting things up for the future so that it will go well for his sons, based on what he's hearing from God. And so this is part of it, setting Ephraim and Manasseh up. He knows something about the future about Ephraim. He's perceived something, and he's acting on it to set it up. So he's acting on behalf of God in a way, like helping to set things up. That's how. So here we actually see two birth orders being played, right? So first of all, he's setting Yosef up, receiving a double portion inheritance in the land, which is a very typical first son, like firstborn gift. And then he's also switching Ephraim and Manasseh. So two different generations are having swaps happening right here in this very short period of text. So Yaakov is doing a big thing. It's his last will and testament, his last acts with his children. I think we can go to the next one. So my question here is, this is just meant to be for thought here. There's an interesting passage in chapter 48 where it says that Israel's eyes were dim with age and that he could not see. And so he was brought Ephraim and Manasseh close, kissed them, embraced them, and then Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see you again, and here God has let me see your children as well. Now you could say, listen, he's just talking about in the past when he could see Ephraim and Manasseh. Linguistically, it could make sense to say that. But in this passage here, when he's just about to make a prophetic utterance that Ephraim is going to supersede Manasseh, he's seeing something that you can't see in the physical. He's seeing something so he's blind, yet he sees, is my point. I think that is like this nice hint in the text here. That's what's happening. All right, so now we get to the portion where Israel talks to all of his 12 sons, and he wants to tell them about the days of the future. And if you look at the end of verse 1 there, the two Hebrew words at the end there, it's acharit hayamim, which is where it really sounds like the last days, right? Like it sounds the end of days, the final days. You could translate it that way, which is why this starts to sound a little bit, this is not sounding like a normal, bless you, have a good time, have lots of kids, be fruitful, good luck. And when we read through the blessings or the declarations he's making, they start to get very interesting. And so the ones that I want to focus on, I'm just going to focus on Judah here to save time. But please, in our discussions, we can go all over the different blessings of the different brothers because there are interesting details. Just as way of introduction to this, if you look at Simeon and Levi, just before he blesses Judah, he says that they will be scattered among Israel in response to the intensity of their anger and their wrath. And so they'll be spread out. And as in the future, that's exactly what happened. Levi was spread out all over Israel, served as the priesthood all over Israel, had no central place to call home. So obviously an utterance that very literally came true. Simeon ended up living in the realm of Judah, and so didn't, in a way, had a region, but then was spread out. When you look at the places where Simeon lived, there wasn't like one central region. So that also came to pass when you look at the details. Okay, so let's get to Judah now. And I hope I'm going to just touch on some details here that I don't feel qualified to actually interpret. This is the way that the Hebrew is. It's just got these little interesting tidbits. So the first thing that I noticed in the blessing of Judah is there's a contrast of two different types of animals. Here you'll see the lion, the cub, the lioness in the first portion, which I have in the box on the top. And then you'll see at the bottom, there is this idea of tethering an ass or a donkey. And then it refers to tethering the son of the female donkey. In the Hebrew, in the English, the translation is not quite as good, but here it says b'ni atono, which is a female donkey, aton. And so you have actually a contrast of these two different types of animals. And it's very reminiscent of prophets when they start in the future talking about animals, when you hear about the metaphors about David, lion of the tribe of Judah, all this type of language. Right here, this stuff in the future comes to pass. And another thing that I found very interesting was in the Hebrew here, if you look at the verse 11, this idea of washing garments in wine and the robe in the blood of grapes, that you have two different words that are contrasted. Is like in the Hebrew is where it's talking about garment, and then it's using suto is the last word there for the robe. And if you start looking up those words and trying to like figure out kind of the Hebrew there, it gets very interesting, just as a kind of detail. And another verse 10 is like it's very declarative of the Davidic kingdom that's coming. So now it's where you're like, okay, this has got to be prophetic. Like we're watching, what Jacob has foreseen essentially, and is declaring the scepter won't depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. So the tribute shall come to him, and the homage of peoples be his. Now, the English translation sounds very, okay, good. Tribute shall come to him and homage to people. But the Hebrew is actually much more interesting. And for those on our call who are qualified to talk a little bit more about this Hebrew, you see that word I highlighted there, the Shiloh, is a very interesting word that is translated in the English, tribute shall come to him. But it has there's been a lot of discussion, I think, between the rabbis about that word in the past, and I just wanted to highlight it because it is a very interesting thing. Now, another thing that I have to bring up, and I know for those of us who aren't Hebrew experts, it might go over your head, but like Shiloh here, the way it's spelled, I noticed that in one of the Hebrew Tanakhs I had, it actually spelt it with a vav instead of a hey, and then put the Hay version of Shiloh in brackets, which I thought was interesting. And then the other two words that also have that pattern are the other two blue words, and where they're like the possessive would have a vav, but here it's spelt with a Hay. And so it's still translated in the possessive in the English. And so once we get in, if we can get into those details, that would be really fun. And yeah, so the blessing of Judah, there's all the other blessings. There's also the blessing to Joseph that's really quite very interesting to look at. But what I want to do is just jump to the questions here, looking at the time, and we can come back to any of those details. So my first question I'll throw out was what I opened with here, is what is the essence of Jacob's insistence in being returned to the field of Machpelah to rest with his fathers? Just thinking about in Yaakov's mind, in Israel's mind, why is that such an important, passionate issue for him to being brought back to the land and buried here? I think that's interesting to talk about. Second is, what kind of timeline is in Israel's heart when he blesses Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh? And do we think that way? Now, I've already introduced that idea that Jacob here is thinking about hundreds of years in the future. The issues he's dealing with are in the future. And not just like 50 years, not just 10 years. We're talking about hundreds of years in the future. And so that's a timeline and a scale that I think is, for me, it just makes my brain wiggle a little bit to sit there and think, I can't imagine thinking on that timeline and being genuinely invested and emotional about causing events or contributing to events or preparing inheritances hundreds of years in the future. It's a very cool idea. And the third is, what end of days role is Israel prophesying over his son Judah? And are these words still shaping the world that we live in today? And so just to end my opening here, I do think that there are echoes of what Jacob said so long ago at work today in the land of Israel. I'm not sure how we can define the tribe of Judah today, but to say that there is a role for the Israel today to represent that blessing and that declaration over Judah, and that all the nations are influenced and impacted by Judah's inheritance. And so I'll leave with that. If there's any, Ruth, is there any points of order here before we move on? I see, Alan, I see your hands.
I'd just like to ask Jocelyn to put the questions in the chat so that everyone can see them. And we have two people that like to comment, so we're going to start with Alan.
Commenting on question one, what is the essence of Jacob's insistence on being returned to the field of Machpelah to rest with his fathers? And it's good to recall that this is the first property that our forefather Abraham bought and owned in the land. It's not just this romantic notion of going back to a theoretical homeland that Jacob is talking about. From his point of view, it's already owned, and it's a forerunner for the expansion for the entire land of Israel itself. So I think there's an element of that predestination, if you want to think of it in those terms, built into his request. That's just my initial thought.
Can I quickly respond to that? One detail that stood out to me in Jacob's blessing to Ephraim and Manasseh is he says that they will bear my name and the name of their father. And I find that very interesting. The idea is that there's this, I wonder if what you're saying just made me think of that what if Jacob was thinking about he needed to be in the cave of Machpelah as a root of some of this. They needed to bear his name. It wasn't appropriate for him to be in Egypt.
And in 1948, in the modern era, the UN accepted the name of Israel for the modern state of Israel. And Israel is Jacob's other name.
Excellent. Good point. Thank you. Yeah, Ear.
I think one of the really interesting aspects of the Parsha is this notion of 3 generations. This is the first time Torah, and I think even in the Tanakh, where you actually have a grandfather talking to his grandchild. It's very significant here. It even says later that even Joseph had his great-grandchildren born on his lap, so to speak. So here we see, I think, one of the key principles of the Abrahamic covenant, which is that Abraham was chosen because God knows that he will educate his children and the grandchildren in the ways of God to do justice and charity. So basically, we see this beginning to happen. That we actually see that the heritage of Abraham is being passed from one generation to the next, even reaching a third generation or fourth generation. There's no one in the animal kingdom that has anything like it. You have in the animal kingdom sometimes relationships between parents or in a tribe, but you don't have this notion of passing things from one generation to the next in a way that actually enables humanity to advance the way humanity has advanced. And here we actually see this. And it occurred to me when you talked about Judah, it was so interesting. Sheila, Ad Giavos Shiloh, until Shiloh will come. And just remember, Judah had this whole story with Tamar, and things didn't go well with the first two sons. And then we have the birth of these twins that come forth. And here, I think it reminds us, it's almost like an analogy of the Jewish people, right? The Jewish people are named Jewish because we're Judah, because we're from the tribe of Judah, or at least from the kingdom of Judah. Could very well be that we're from many tribes, but we all come from the kingdom of Judah. And here again, there were like two temples that did not go well, that did not end well. And we have a promise here, Ad Ki Avos Shiloh, Sheila is the third son of Judah that Tamar did not get, right? Sheila, it's the same letters, Shin, Lamed, Hey. So this is perhaps showing a parallel here that ultimately God is promising that the Mashiach will ultimately come forth from the tribe of Judah, who has the mantle, and perhaps there's a very interesting symbolic relationship with the story of Judah himself. So we see the future and the present very strongly connected.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I was on the altar of prayer this morning, and Dean told a really interesting story about a woman whose husband died on a bus on the way to make Aliyah to Israel, and she insisted that his body come with her to make Aliyah. And the reason was because they wanted the children from Russia to go to the place where the bones of their parents were. That if any of them were left in Russia, then their allegiance would be to the place where their ancestors were buried, and they wanted that to be Israel.
Very nice.
Interesting.
Let's see.
We were on these words earlier today as Ruth is sharing. And I don't know if anybody else noticed it this particular year, but you notice the amount of detail Jacob goes to ensure that they know where to bury. He gave so much detail. It just shows how emphatic he was that his bones would not remain. And of course, if you continue to read the rest of the story through to the end of into the next chapter, he dies, and you watch a burial procession like no other. Not only, and I asked the question, and maybe some of our Jewish friends could tell us, is that not only did they embalm the body for 40 days, not only under Egyptian rule did they wait 70 days, and then this incredible entourage of honor, Egyptian, from the court of Pharaoh, and of course many of the family members of Jacob would journey not through Canaan to Hebron, but on the west side of the Dead Sea, come around to the threshing floor of Atad near the Jordan River, and it would be there that they would sit Shiva for 7 days. Is there another place in the book of Bereshit or Genesis where we see a sitting of Shiva for 7 days? And it was like critically important, so that, and it wasn't just, we've already done the Egyptian rituals. Now we're doing something would be effectively land that would be called Israel on the east side of the Jordan River. Okay, it yet today is still not that, but there they would end up they would change the name of this place to a place that, is it called the place of mourning for something to do with Egypt's mourning? I'm not looking at it right now. Maybe someone
Yeah.
else.
Yes, Ephraim and Manasseh. Yes. The morning of Egypt.
Anyway, I find this very fascinating, and I wonder if there's any link of those 7 days sitting Shiva for Jacob that continues yet today.
Good question, Dean.
Look, I
Anybody
think
like
that's
to?
another beautiful example of how the past and the present are very strongly connected. We see here even this notion of the Egyptians carrying Jacob's bones back to the land where he belongs is very similar, I think, of prophecies of Isaiah, where you have the nations carrying Israel back as offerings, right, to the land. It's almost like every single thing that Israel or Jacob does here, he knows that it's going to not just be true now, but it's actually going to set the stage for the future, similar to what you said, Gapes, in your presentation.
Excellent. And anybody else who hasn't had a
Yeah,
chance to speak
Dina
yet?
has her hand up.
Dina.
Yeah, I just thought of something. It's a little far-fetched, but there is an idea, at least among the commentators, the Midrash, that when there's 7 days before the flood, it's as if God is sitting Shiva. He's sitting Shiva. He's mourning the destruction of the world that he created. And it does say that there were 7 days before the flood.
Wow. Interesting. Does anybody have any thoughts about the second question, which is, I have to do it on my phone here, the timeline in Israel's heart when he blesses Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh? And Gabe mentioned this a little bit about how it seemed to be quite a futuristic idea. What thoughts do you have about that?
I can throw out an idea that
Okay.
if anybody else raises their hand, I'll cede the floor here. But for example, like right now, when we're talking about reestablishing the state of Israel, when we're talking about rebuilding the third temple, when we're talking about rebuilding the things that need to be developed, not only in Israel, but out in the nations, the relationship between the nations and Israel, right? If we're thinking in terms of just 20 years, 10 years, then that's not long enough. I think if you think, like you take different actions when you're thinking about what are we going to do when in 400 years from now, I don't know if we'll all be here in the same way 400 years or children or whatnot, but that you think differently and you take actions differently. And that's part of what I was thinking here is that if you take God's word seriously, if you really believe that God means what he says, and then you start to take action that in your lifetime will not yield fruit, like you're planting trees, so to speak, that future generations will eat from. But you can only do that when you're seeing through the eyes of faith, based on what has God said and how are you being called to action. And I think you can live with a lot more peace if you're looking at that kind of timeline.
Hard to do, but
Yeah.
a good point of view.
One of the things that you mentioned, Gabe, was this switching of the hands or the birthright, not necessarily going through the first one, which I think has several very interesting possible meanings. First of all, we see how he takes Ephraim. Why does he choose Ephraim over Manasseh? Is there any obvious reason? He simply says that Ephraim is going to be greater. And in what way is he going to be greater? He's going to be he'll be filling the nations. Melo hagoyim. What is this thing about filling the nations? Especially since we have representatives from the nations. I think it's interesting to note this, that it seems that even when Isaac sent him to Lavan and he tells him that he is getting the blessing of Abraham, he also blesses him that he will become a multitude of nations. So the relationship between Israel and the nations is not a side story. It seems to be almost the main story. And it's so much the main story that Isaac emphasizes it with Jacob. And when Jacob sees in the future that Ephraim is going to be much more connected to the nations, and he sees that Joseph is already acting within the nations, that seems to take precedence. I find it it's almost like as if when he sees that dream with the ladder, and he says, "Oh, now I know we have to create a house of prayer for all of the nations." Here, this is, in other words, from the very beginning, Israel represents the one who was chosen to connect between God, Hashem, and the nations, and the one who takes on that role is the one who gets precedence when it comes to birthright.
Wow.
That's the takeaway that I get.
Gosh. I see your hand there, Dean, but I'm going to ask Kim because I haven't heard from her yet today, and
Yeah,
we'll
Moshe
get
after
back
that.
to you.
I wanted to just piggyback off of what Yair just asked that question. It's very interesting that there's a couple of things that you see. What you're seeing coming through Yosef is you're seeing the covenant of Abraham coming all the way through to Yosef. The covenant, and we see the Mosaic covenant, we see the covenant of Moshe, that is going to flow right through Judah. But what flows through Ephraim is to the nations. And the other thing is very interesting is that he names Manasseh after Manasseh, meaning I will forget, right? But Ephraim means to multiply. And so we see that his name alone is already indicative of the same bracha, the same blessing that was passed or given initially to Abraham, even passed through Rivka and on to Ephraim. So I got very excited about that as well. It was covenantal. Absolutely covenantal. It was not just he's the younger, because the focus is always on the younger and the older. It was not, I don't think it was about that. It was about the passing of the covenant. So
These people seem to be able to remember their fathers. They remember what God said to their forefathers and they don't let go of it. And I think that's characteristic of Jewish people today. Moshe,
absolutely.
Yes, shalom.
shalom.
First, I have to say that this background is the sunset that we had today.
Oh, it was amazing.
Whoa,
It was amazing. Yeah.
amazing.
Dina and I were looking also. It was just amazing.
Okay. But instead of talking about the present, I'll tell you the idea that came up to my mind. We are not regular to think upside down or from the end to the beginning. But if we think of Yaakov giving blessings according to the end state, he has a prophecy of the end state of this whole thing. And that connects to what Gabe talked about, Achrit Hayamim, the last of days. It isn't that there won't be more days after that, but it's the end state of days. So if we know, somebody knows, if Yaakov knows of how the last day is going to look, the end state is going to look like, now you can start going in the reverse and think and say and bless what has to be done now, so you will arrive at that station. That's it.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Amazing. Dina.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry I'm not feeling 100%, so I'm not showing myself. I just wanted to say, if you look at Yair's background in a minute, you'll see our community. And I remember thinking about my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who are really from Slovakia on both sides. And there's nothing left there of the Jewish presence in their town. And in so many places where my forebears lived hundreds of years ago in Europe, there's very little left. There's very little left. As opposed to when we moved here, and even the neighborhoods I lived in New York have all changed. And when we came here 40-some years ago and we built our community, we really believed, and we still have that faith, that we're building something for the long distance, for the future. And it's a very different feeling. And that's our faith and our hope that what we're building here will last for many centuries.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
That's really interesting, Dina. It speaks to the last part of question 3, where Gabe asks, are the words shaping the world we live in today? And I think you gave a good example of that, of how you live there, knowing that a future's coming. Are there any other ideas about that for all of us? Alan.
So obviously, when the prophets wrote and spoke, everything was a long-range prophecy. The reason why we have the 48 prophets cataloged out of over 1.2 million prophets who were lesser prophets and were not long-range prophets, the reason why we have those 48 in writing is because all of their predictions were longer range, on the order of hundreds, even thousands of years. We know about Jacob's dream when he was approaching Mount Moriah. He woke up and he saw the ladder and the angels going up and down the ladder. And all of that was indicative of a long-range exile and a long-range history yet to unfold. So I think the idea of projecting thousands of years is normative to the Jewish tradition in just about every prophetic sense of the word. I don't know how you would look at it otherwise. If you look at the last 2,000 years, you've had the rise of Christian civilization, you've had the rise of Islamic civilization, you have a number of other civilizations that are non-monotheistic that exist as well, but Jewish civilization was thought to have been wiped out. And we know prophetically it's going to be resurrected, which ties into the whole theme of resurrection, which is a whole nother discussion I won't get into at this point. But the emergence, or the reemergence, I should say, of Jewish civilization in the land of Israel, where the people are speaking the same language they did 3,000 years ago, worshiping the same God they did 3,000 years ago, and are beginning to live a life similar to what they did 3,000 years ago, at least ideologically, is emerging. And it's the very thing that is stoking the worldwide resistance to that notion, which they thought they had somehow buried or sidestepped and made irrelevant. And I think the paradigm shift is flipping that on its head along the lines that Moshe was just talking about.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, can I just ask Dean if he still has something to say, which I
Of course.
didn't give him a chance to say? Dean, did you want to say something before we go back to
You
you?
might return a little bit later on
Okay,
that question.
good.
Keep it on
And then
where it's
maybe
going.
after Yair, there are some people who haven't said anything yet that we'd really like to hear from. So maybe while Yair's speaking, you could be thinking of what you would like to contribute. Okay, Yair?
I just wanted to use a very interesting example to your question, Ruth. When it comes to the tribe of Dan, it talks about a snake-like capability to outmaneuver or to overcome the enemy in a devious way. And the sages, when they try to interpret, is this short-term, long-term, middle-term, what exactly is he talking about here? Then they say perhaps it refers to Shimshon, who of course takes down the Philistines in a very underhanded way, altogether, the way he deals with the Philistines. So one could go ahead and say that was mid-range, right? It was about the future of the tribe of Dan during the time of the judges. But today, and you might not know this, there's actually an army unit called Shimshon, the same name. And it's called Shimshon because it also does things in a very devious and surprising way. So we can actually see how whatever it was that Yisrael or Yaakov was blessing them was true for the short term, it was true for the middle term, and it was true for the long term, because we really are talking about characteristics that he sees in the different tribes, what they bring to the nation as a nation to achieve, as Moshe said, to achieve ultimately the end times. And we see really how in the last 2 years, Israel has really had done amazing things by outsmarting and outmaneuvering the enemy, like Shimshon. And we also see God seeming to be doing the same thing now with Iran. I don't know if anybody noticed, but really interesting things are now happening with Iran. And they too are falling by their own sword. They are literally destroying themselves without us having to do almost anything.
Amazing. Yeah, we've noticed you here.
I'm
Moshe.
sure.
Yes, just very shortly, I want to show you a picture. Anybody know who this is?
It's too small.
Benjamin.
Okay, that's a prophet standing on his head.
Right, Ben-Gurion.
It's Ben Gurion.
Oh,
Alan, you said upside down.
He lost his
Sometimes
hair.
you have to think upside down. That's what Ben Gurion did.
wow. That's a great photo. That's great.
And it's for sale if you want a copy.
There you go. 102 shekels.
Okay, somebody else who hasn't said anything. Rick would like to say something.
It's interesting that Joseph at the end tells his brothers that when they leave Egypt, they're to take his bones with them. And I think it's related to Jacob wanting to go back to Machpelah to be buried. And I think it's also related to the friction that existed between Joseph and his brothers and how empty power can be. Joseph was next to Pharaoh, ruled, and yet his brothers feared that he had a grudge against them. And when their father died, they approached him with a fictitious message from Jacob that Joseph was not to take revenge on them. And what Joseph says to them, I need to trust you guys because after I die, I don't want my remains to stay here. And I have to trust that you guys are going to see that I make it back home. What an insight.
Good, good. Yes,
Wow.
Christine. Hooray.
I just want to say, Rick,
Oh,
you don't speak a lot. You don't speak enough. But every time you say something, it's wow.
thank you.
Thank you, Dee.
I agree. Can I interject that kudos to Kim Hadassah for the Enum AI. Wow, wow, wow. Okay, that was an interject. How long was the journey from Egypt back to the burial site in Canaan? How long did they have to go to get there?
Who knows that?
Do you mean the direct
How many
route?
days journey did it take them to get back to Canaan from Egypt? Just wondering.
I think it's in the Torah. I think it's indicated. I just don't remember the number.
I think it's 11 days.
Yeah, I read they could have gotten there in 2 weeks if they had gone straight there. Not in this story, but when they left Egypt and Passover.
11 days, it says then. Yeah.
11. Okay.
Are you
I'm sure there's
Are you
something to
it's not-
that. And then I'll go very personal. We have our second born son's name is Daniel Joseph. And we've got him, he's read the whole story of Joseph, and we're trying to get him to, he doesn't read the Bible or anything, but I just want everybody to pray for our Daniel Joseph that he'll start seeing the light. Let's just put it that way.
Amen. And many of us have named our children in the hopes that they will live up to their forebears of that name.
Even Gabriel has both names in his name.
Yeah,
Gabriel.
I have Joseph and Daniel, my two middle names. Yeah. I'm just looking to see if it actually says how long it took them.
I just wanted to say that it could take 40 years the other way.
Good.
Yeah.
There were reasons for that.
Christiane, what are you thinking? You always have something good to say.
I was thinking about legacy. Here in the West, I think
You're cutting out a bit, Christiane. Maybe if you turn your...
And we lost video.
You're frozen, Christiane.
Yeah, Christiane, if you turn your
Yes.
video off, maybe that would help.
in the way,
She's not hearing.
yeah. Okay. Oh yeah, I do hear you.
Yeah,
Do you hear
okay.
me now?
Say what
Yeah,
you
we hear
said
you now.
again.
Okay. Yeah. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. That's my internet at this end. It's not stable because of the freezing cold. So in the West, I often sense that we're very short-term type of thinking. And I feel that with the connection with Israel through Ephraim, I've been started like a few years ago to think about legacy. What will I leave? What am I leaving to my children and my grandchildren? And I was really struck by Rabbi Sachs' thing saying about blessing your grandchildren. Like my grandchildren are now adult. They're over 20 years old. And strangely, about a year ago, I started talking to my daughter about legacy. So I've decided to use the money from the sale of my house to build on the house of my daughter, where I now live. And I said to her, I'm leaving you this as a legacy. This is my legacy. And now I'm thinking, I've got to teach her to leave it to my grandchildren. And if I have learned anything very important about those study is about legacy. What do we leave when we go, when we die? And to me, Israel is an example of this. So thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
a practical example of legacy.
I was going to just attach something, Christiane, to what you were saying. I was thinking before that for those of us on the call who are not Jews, who are not Israel connected in terms of, like, the question comes to us too, is like, how do we plan for our future? How do we plan to posture not just ourselves, but then our families? And having a vision for the future, where you're not just thinking about surviving today, eating enough today, having enough to pay for your rent. Those are important things. There's a courage that comes with, it's not easy to have the courage to get over the awkwardness of trying to inject a sense of legacy and future into your family, into your children. It's like fighting a war. And that's a noble war to fight, to say we have a purpose, we have meaning, and we need to find that meaning. And that's connected to this too. Like, we're looking, the Bible is a wonderful teaching tool, an instrument for us to learn from Israel's story and journey. And then we're called to be in relationship with Israel, but then to also do the important work that needs to be done in our own midst, in our own families, without appropriating, pretending, or trying to be something we're not. Just thought to throw that in there. Alan.
I was just going to build on what Gabe was just saying. Depending on how you want to look at it, the Judaism, the Jewish people, the Jewish history is based essentially on the notion that Hashem has granted us the status of being an eternal nation, an eternal people. Those words actually appear in the Torah and Tanakh a number of times. That's a daunting task for any group of people. And it's not just about father to son to grandson kind of thing. It's got to go beyond that. Judaism is connected to a people, often in a very genetic way, but often it has an open door for those to come in and attach, but to a land. So Judaism has often been mischaracterized as just another religion, but it's also about a people and it's about a land, both of which have longevity in and of themselves, aside from religion often being fairly long-lived. There have probably been hundreds of religions that no longer exist on the face of the earth, but the nations that those people came from probably persist in some way, and the ethnicity of those people persist in some way. Judaism is a complex construct: religion, ethnicity, and land. And it's done through family relationship. It's done through generational transmission. We share generational trauma. We share generational knowledge. We share generational history, regardless of being dispersed among the nations. And now that's coalescing, and we see, if anybody's been looking at the demographics, Israel is the only place on the face of the earth where the Jewish people are growing in number. They are declining everywhere else on the face of the earth, according to prophecy, and it's happening. All you got to do is look at the numbers. But being an eternal nation, and again, if you believe in God and you take what he says seriously, it's got to manifest in some way. So being manifested both as a faith, as an ethnicity, and as a geographical designated land reinforces this concept of eternity. So I don't think that makes it easy for us, because Jewish history is anything but easy. Anybody who's studied it knows that there's a lot of horror built into that. But there are reinforcing elements. Obviously, without Hashem, it would never happen. But Judaism, in that sense, is a distinct religion because it has the ethnicity and geography connected very intimately and very prophetically and very mystically to its eternal propagation, I guess is what I'm saying. So I don't know how you replicate that. I don't know if it is replicable through simple belief or faith. It takes a very deep faith to be able to maintain that kind of connectivity. And even among the Jewish people, we have components that fall off along the way. So it's not like it's a perfect solution for anybody. So I'm just pondering the question that Gabe was posing and trying to expand the focus on how it works.
Nice.
Good thought, Alan.
Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts. Back to Dean.
Yeah, I was just going to say that when I've had privilege and honor to speak or share in a Jewish community, it often evolves around the subject of Aliyah. And I find that the word legacy sometimes connects with the Jewish people, especially living in the diaspora, especially when you're talking about their children or grandchildren, is that's part of your legacy, that in fact, to release a child or a grandchild with your blessing to make their Aliyah, wow. Well, and I would say even at Gabriel's wedding in Ottawa, he sat me at a table with, I guess, Jewish friends of their family, and they complained. That they had a child living in Israel with their grandchildren. It was like, how could they? And I can't tell you, Gabriel, that throughout your wedding, I felt it almost troublesome that they kept, every time they would look at me and know I was dealing with Aliyah, that it was like they were so disgusted that a child would go and have grandchildren in Israel and not live with them in Canada. And I ended that evening with them and I says, listen, I want you to know that you have such an amazing legacy, that you have Israeli grandchildren and children. And I could tell that in speaking, I don't know if it really landed, but I will say this much. they appreciated me taking the time to say something that was very different than what they were thinking and believing and feeling.
And I sat you next to them for a very specific reason, Dean.
I just want to tag on to what Dean said, and we sponsored a single woman to go to Israel this year who was one of two children. She was in her late 20s by herself, going back to Israel and leaving her entire family, her brother, her parents, grandparents, everybody here in Canada. So God is calling people back under difficult but amazing circumstances.
And that's one thing, like encouraging people like that, the ministry that Dean has led and many of us have been part of, finding the little ways that we can encourage people like her in their journey once they're here. Any little bit helps. Just having the human contact of someone else who cares, and especially if you can have goyim that would venture to care and to encourage you and want to support you in your Aliyah. I think that's actually part of, too, my meditation in response to what you were saying, Alan, that sometimes choosing who your friends are and who you're going to encourage and support in this world is a big part of what your calling, the calling that Hashem has given you. He made you who you are, put you in a specific group of people, gave you to a specific mother and father, and you have a calling to fulfill in that place. And if that is encouraging a 27-year-old who is called to make Aliyah, or in my case, to attach myself to a Jewish family and figure out how to do this, let's do it. Let's get into it.
Thank you. It's a personal experience for you. The year will be next, and there's still 2 or 3 people that have not told us how they're thinking and feeling that we'd love to hear from. So we're almost out of time. If you have anything to say, we'll maybe come after you here.
All I wanted to do was add another really interesting notion of legacy. We talk about legacy as something for the future, but very often legacy has very much to do with the past. It's very interesting at the end of the Parsha, when the brothers are concerned that Joseph might take revenge upon them. The words that they use in Hebrew is Lu Yistamenu Yosef, that perhaps Joseph will hate us, and then, of course, he will do these other things. But the word in Hebrew, Lu, is actually a hope that he will hate us. And that is a very interesting take on what's really happening here. It could very well be that the brothers are saying, we really did such a terrible thing that we need to be punished for it. If we won't get punished for it, who knows what this legacy of this terrible thing that we did to our brother will do to our children and to our grandchildren going down further. And we actually know that there were later generations. There's this, for example, on Yom Kippur, we have this prayer where we recount the story of the Roman emperor actually or the local decreeing that 10 of the great sages, including Rabbi Akiva, be put to death because of what those 10 brothers did to Joseph, selling him to Egypt. So it's sometimes the legacy can also be something that we have to really grapple with, that we have to do something to fix it. And in many ways, there are those who say today, after the 2 years of war that we had, where we also had, like Joseph was in the pit for 2 years. So here we had more than 200 who were like in the pit, in the tunnels for 2 years, and the entire nation came together in order to get all of them, to bring all of them home. There are those that say that finally this terrible thing that was done 3,500 years ago with Joseph and with the brothers to Joseph has finally been rectified by what has actually happened at the end of this war.
Wow, that's really interesting. Okay,
That's Kabbalistic rectification. That's a beautiful one.
nice. Anybody else? We got just a couple minutes left.
Yeah,
Jane, Catherine.
Oh, Jane, good. Let's hear what Jane has to say.
Hey, shalom.
hello.
I'm just listening to the conversations and thinking about the whole idea of the yearning that has come upon not only Israel, but I believe even for the nations. There is this yearning to return back to the homeland. And this whole idea of a even from some of us who have got people who are maybe living in other nations, especially for Africans, there is some similarity in the historical narratives of dispersion of the Jews and Africans. So we keep on hearing this whole idea of a yearning to return back to Africa. And when it comes to burials, culturally, even us here in Africa, we believe that one must always be returned back to the homeland, returned back to your ancestors. So when Jacob is telling his children to back, I'm just intrigued by this whole idea of the similarities that are there between what Israel has had to go through and what for us Africans have also gone through in terms of trauma, in terms of maybe not at the same levels, but there is so much similarity. And it takes me back to the whole idea of that the blessing that was placed upon Ephraim, looking at generations ahead and beyond the timeline of the life of Ephraim in that and time. I have so many conflicting questions, and it's like I just need to sit for hours and just have a discussion about this whole. I think maybe Joshua understands a little bit where I am coming from. Sorry, Joshua, to put you in that spot. I hope you're still there. But I'm so intrigued by the conversation. We could just continue it because a lot is coming into my heart and my spirit about the whole affair. So
Amen.
Thank you so much for your deliberations. I'm really blessed.
Thanks, Jane, for
Thank you,
sharing.
Jane. Okay, Joshua.
Joshua, yeah, he's got his camera on.
Yeah,
You'll be the last one, Joshua.
yeah, the discussion has been very interesting. I hear Catherine, and really mine is more or less a question about words that are spoken in chapter 48, verse. Okay, I think Gabriel did mention something about Yaakov being able to see or not to see, having been blind. And I think, for example, in verse 48, in chapter 48, verse 8, he says, when Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, who are these? It's a plural. So what is he seeing? He had been with Ephraim, Manasseh, he knew them. So what a question is this? So that aspect of Yaakov's sin is very interesting to me. And I wonder whether he is also doing the same thing with these other guys, with the rest of the 12. When he is blessing them, what is he seeing? Oh, okay. Is he also seeing? Maybe to ask that question. Now, my other question is parallel in chapter 46, verse 4, that God goes down with Yaakov. He promises to go down with him and to come up with him, to ascend, to descend. And I think the language there is very similar to the language of chapter 28, verse 14, if I'm not wrong, verse 12, sorry. 28, verse 12. The angels were ascending, descending. God says he is descending, he is going down with him. He is. So I was wondering what kind of overlap is that? What does that really mean exactly? God had said he would the ascending, descending in chapter 28, verse 12. Then a similar language in chapter 46, verse 4. I don't know.
Wow.
So those are, and I am still fascinated, and I think this goes back to Catherine. I'm really fascinated about Joseph Jacob and Joseph, and now Ephraim. That is quite a fascination. So those are the things that have been going on in my mind
Joshua,
as we reflect.
you've raised 3 questions that are huge and enough material for another
Maybe
whole
I can
session.
say something.
That's
I
the
can
way to
say
end a
something
meeting.
really short and brief, and that
Oh,
is
okay.
something really short and brief.
Okay.
And that notice that Isaac, when he blessed Jacob, he was also not able to see. And even though Jacob stole the blessing, he says that he shall be blessed. And I think that indicates that what he was seeing is not with his eyes. It was something metaphysical and into the future. And therefore, whatever blessing he gave really came not from himself, it came God through him as a conduit. And if that is the case with Isaac, I presume it's the same thing here with Jacob. And Jacob actually says, I'm going to tell you what will be in the future. So clearly he feels that he is serving as a conduit. So even though he does not, his physical eyes are limited, he's definitely seeing not just beyond what there exists at that time, but into the future.
Amazing. And as we study these words even today, it helps us to see what God is doing in the present and into the future. So I want to thank Gabe very much for the presentation and for all the comments and things to think about for the coming week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gabe. Also, we look so much forward to more of your sessions. We love them.